Welcome back to our conversation about mental health. We've covered some very important topics so far. For this session, we're going to be talking about grief. We're recording this around the Christmas season. The reality is that holidays especially are a time when we can experience this emotion, this feeling. Maybe this year, for some of you, that it's the first time a loved one is not going to be, this is the first holiday you're celebrating without that person, without grandma, grandpa, or a husband or a wife. And we just want to spend a little bit of time talking about what grief is and how we can respond to that. Kyle, thanks for being back with us.
You're welcome.
Let's start where we've always started. What is grief? Just give us a little bit of a definition, framing of that.
Yeah, grief it's really a universal emotion. Again, you can't be human and not feel and experience grief many times throughout life. And it really comes from an expectation that we have, a hope that we have, and we don't get it. You know, Scripture says hope deferred makes the heart sick. And so it really, grief can feel much like a sickness because this hope we have, whether it be my loved ones stay in my life, or my marriage work, or my kid doesn't rebel, or, like whatever it is, it can be both a real loss that we have in our life, like something that we had and now we no longer have that.
Right.
So we were grieving it, or a perceived loss. I thought by this time I would be here, and I'm not. I'd hoped to be able to get to this goal, and now I can't get there from here. So it can be a life dream that we grieve, and those are harder for people to see and identify, so they're feeling grief, and grief will often run right alongside anxiety or depression. It's the same. Grief and depression are sisters. I talked about anxiety and depression being cousins.
Right.
These are sisters. They often are right there together. So someone who's depressed, they don't have to be depressed because they're grieving. And someone who's grieving doesn't have to be depressed, but they often end up in the same valley for a season.
Right.
So, it really is kind of looking at that perceived loss or that real loss, and then the emotions that come in.
So it's a gap
Yes.
between expectations and what I hoped would happen and reality. And what you're saying is this is not just about somebody who's lost a loved one. Because I think most of the time when I think about grief, I think about in terms of we're at a funeral and those people are grieving that are missing their father, missing their husband, whatever. What you're saying is this is a more universal emotion that oftentimes we may be feeling and experiencing. We don't even recognize it because we thought we would have something, or we have a certain perception of how we wanted to be seen, and those haven't come to pass.
Yep, and it may be that even you don't understand why you're grieving because you haven't had what I would say everyone else looks at and goes, oh, well, they should be grieving. They just lost grandma. Things like that make sense. It's a common grief. But that individual expectation and hope that you have that you're grieving, not only do other people not understand that because they may not have that same expectation or hope.
Right.
And so,
what's the big deal? Why did you hope to be there? That's not a big deal.
Yeah, get over that.
Right. But it was a huge deal to you.
Yes, it was built into the core of what you've wanted for, since you were 5, maybe.
Right.
And now all of a sudden you can't get there. And so you're feeling lethargic. You can't get out of bed. People, it's like, why is he so unmotivated? Nothing's happened to him. No, there's a loss of a dream. And that person may not even realize that's why they're grieving until you really start looking at where is this loss.
So the very little I've done in looking at grief and trying to understand it, I know that a lot of times I hear counselors talk about stages of grief people walk through. I know there's some identifiable kind of descriptive categories people kind of walk through. Can you walk us through really quick what are some of those common stages people walk through when they're grieving? Yeah,
we often break them into stages, but I think, and that's helpful to talk about them, but I think the misunderstanding that then comes is like, okay, we go through it like a tunnel. Right. And if you start in at stage 1, you go stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, and that is just not the case. No, you can enter grief really in any stage, and it's more like they're all around the wall, and you just bump and bounce until you get out of it. And so it's like you get dropped into the, and you just bounce around in grief until you can. I would say stage 5 is when you're actually getting out of the hole that you're bouncing around in.
Gotcha.
One of the first ones that people often bounce into, it's not the first one, because you'll see when I talk about the others, you can identify, oh, I've been there and I may have started there.
Right.
Would be denial. Well, this isn't really happening, and you see that most easily with the loss of a loved one. Someone gets sick And so, they're gonna pull through, they're gonna make it, so there's this sense of denial of how sick they really are.
Right.
And you're standing there hearing the report from the doctor, and this other person can't hear it, but you're like going, this is not good news, because we are not stuck in denial. And so then it's like two people hear the same doctor say the same words, and they come away with two different experiences. And
because one's in denial, and
one's in denial.
Right.
Those words could not sink into their brain, and so denial. And if you get stuck there really is a disconnect from reality, and it's like, what is going on with this person? They're like happy when it's like they're not experiencing the full range of emotions.
It's not syncing up with reality at
no.
all. Right.
And again, denial can lead to addictions and all other kinds of things, because you're not really dealing with the grief of the moment. And so it also serves as a positive thing, because a lot of times we can't absorb the full impact of what we're hearing, and so denial is a God-given gift.
It's kind of a coping mechanism
to allow it to come in waves, so that we don't just curl up into a ball and die.
Right.
Because it's so heavy, the news that we're hearing and the grief that we're feeling.
Right.
And so denial serves a good purpose, but you can't live there.
Right.
And so then sometimes you go into bargaining. And that's often, well, if we do this, then we'll get this. And if I try that, then I can do this. And so you see the grief of a parent trying to bargain with their kid to get them unstuck from this situation. And how can I manipulate their behavior by giving them this or doing that or doing the right thing or the wrong thing? And I don't want to mess it up. And so they start, and sometimes they'll create literal, like agreements.
Right.
We're bargaining to try to get, you want what you want, I want what I want, because we're grieving the loss of what neither of us can get to. And so there's denial that it can happen, then bargaining, but it's in the place of when it's a loved one. It's like, oh, well, I need to spend more time with them. I need to do this. And so they're trying to bargain. We see it in our prayer life. Oh, God, if you'll just give me, it's like we're trying to create this agreement with God. And again, not that those things are bad. All of those things can be helpful in getting us and dealing with and coping with grief. But you've got to recognize it as that's what you're in the middle of when you're doing this and the purpose that it serves. And so anger is another one. You'll see people get mad at God, they get mad at their spouse, they get mad because they're grieving the loss of what it is that they wanted. That hope deferred makes their heart sick. And so sometimes people jump right in. They'll fall into the hole of grief, and anger is the first thing that comes back out. Yeah. They shoot out like a cannon, and they're at everything, they're at everyone, they're raging, and that's, scares people. They're like, oh my goodness, are you okay? Well, no, they're not okay. They're grieving. And so, and then it can come out in micro bursts in different ways, because again, I'm grieving this, but now your response, I had an expectation that you would respond a certain way to my grief, and you didn't. So now I'm grieving the loss of my perceived need.
I thought you would be more empathetic or caring, and you haven't been, and now I'm angry.
Yes. Right. And so, because I was trying to bargain with you to help me with my grief, and you wouldn't do it, and now I'm mad at you. And really, I'm still grieving this. There's the core issue that's coming out sideways in anger at things and people and situations. But really, it's grief that is needing to be felt. So, but we'll get to that in a minute. Then the next stage is depression, which I talked about earlier when I talked about depression. Right. It's anger turned inward. Right. So grief has both rage, anger turned outward, and depression, anger turned inward. Because there is this sense of, why me, Lord? Why did this happen to me? Right. How does this keep happening to me? Yeah. I keep doing this. I keep filling in the blank. I keep having this expectation and this hope. And so I'm grieving it, but at some level I'm blaming me. And so it's really sitting heavy with me, and I get stuck, and I don't get out of bed, and I don't want to face reality. So denial and depression go together to, like, I'm just shutting all the blinds, I'm turning out the lights, I'm pulling into my bed, and I don't get out for 3 days because I just can't. Right. So so that depression can become very debilitating for people in grief. And the final stage, as you would call it, but I would say it's really where the dawn of a new day, that light starts to break in the darkness of grief, and that would be acceptance. I start to move to a place where I can accept that life can be good without this. It was good before. I don't have to deny that I had a good life, right. But I don't have that person in my life, or I don't have that thing in my life, or I don't have that goal in my life. And so I have to accept the goodness of the Lord in the midst of this, and that he is greater than my grief. And I can embrace God's presence with me so that I can accept and bear and walk and move forward. And then I integrate my grief and my experience to help you with your grief, because now that I've been in it, I know what it's like when you're in it. So my empathy is greater, and my capacity to love is greater, and my understanding is greater if I've moved all the way to acceptance. But if I stay in denial, then I don't have anything to offer you, because I've never felt what you feel.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah, I've never been there.
Yeah, I haven't experienced it.
Right.
Or if I stuck in my rage, nobody wants to come around me. Like, no one wants my help.
Right.
Because, well, gosh, you go talk to them about your grief. Oh, you're going to get an earful. So
Right.
people start steering clear. So any of the other areas in grief that we get stuck in keep us trapped, when really the Bible says grieve, mourn, wail. It gives us permission to feel it and to feel it deeply.
Yeah.
Jesus grieved to the point of sweating drops of blood.
Right. Right.
For the agony he was about to carry, the shame of the world.
Right.
He's grieving that. The sin of the world, grieving that.
Right.
Because he sees it. But for the joy set before him, us, without all the sin, he's willing to face his grief and do what needs to be done. And so he moves to acceptance with the Father.
And I think this is important because I think praise, as it relates to worship, is a very, very important part of our worship. But I think one of the things that gets lost in this discussion, when I go back to the Psalms, is the Psalms are filled not just with praise, but also with lament.
Yes.
And that there's a richness to being able to say, not like sinning against God, like just shouting and yelling at him, but honestly before the Father saying, I am disappointed, I'm sad, I'm down.
Yep.
And I think one of the things culture-wise in the church, and we're going to get to steps about how to respond to this, but culture-wise in our churches, it's important for us to be a place where it's okay to walk in the doors and say, I'm not okay. I don't always have to have this kind of smile on my face, because I do think that's where denial can kind of really get reinforced in an unassuming way, an unintentional way in our church, is that we always have to look what we have together, whereas a lot of times it's okay to be down. So I want to go right to that. What are the steps you would say to somebody who says, man, I didn't realize I'm grieving, but maybe I am. I think it's very subtle. How would you counsel somebody out there who identifies that they're grieving? What are the steps to deal with it?
I think probably the first thing I'd say to anybody is, tell me about that. What are you grieving? So that I could hear it. But I would also then encourage them to feel it. Go ahead, giving people permission to grieve, to continue to grieve. Because a lot of times we want to put a timeline on it. Shouldn't they be over that by now? Well, maybe they could be, but maybe they're not. It doesn't matter what we think they should be doing. It's where are they today, and be with them in that moment. So, and I think the fastest path to acceptance is to accept that you're grieving. It's like,
this is where I'm at.
I feel this. I feel my anger. I feel like I'm trying to cut a deal with somebody or God or something. I'm bargaining. It's like, you don't have to use the same language, but just be real with what you're actually experiencing, so that the feeling is real. So I encourage people to journal. And I tell them to free flow your journal. Like, don't even worry about punctuation or sentence. Just write, and so that you could go back and read it. And it doesn't even have to make sense anymore. Because, again, grief isn't in 1 stage, 2 stage, 3 stage. You may feel anger and depression and bargaining and denial in 3 sentences. It's all right there in the mix. Right. And so to be able to embrace that and then share it, that's the other thing. It's like, once you start sitting with it and actually allowing yourself to feel it, share it with somebody. A trusted friend, a spouse, somebody that will listen openly. I think that's where a trusted counselor is a great resource, because we're trained to listen and sit with and be with, and we're not going to judge. We're not going to evaluate. We're not going to put you on a timeline. It's like, this is where you are, and this is why, and it makes sense. And to be able to offer empathy to someone is a huge part of healing. Like, I hear you. I'll often say to somebody when they're grieving, I see you. I say that phrase. And I can't tell you how many times when I say that to someone, it's just like pushing into a very full sponge, and out comes just weeping because they're seen for the first time. I hear you. I
Yeah.
see you. I
Right.
care.
Right.
I'm with you. And so the second thing is to share it with the Lord, to be able to pour it out in prayer before the Lord. He can handle it. That's what the psalmist did.
Right.
I mean, you read those things and they're just rich with, wow, they're really giving God a good one. You know,
Right.
you know, they're telling him, and they're telling us, well, go smite my enemies, cut off all their heads. You know, it's
Right.
like, get their children too while you're at it.
Right.
You know, it's like they just pour out this anger and this loss and this. There's going. You know, the psalmist is just going in all directions. And so if it's in Scripture, surely it's okay for us to pour that into our journal,
Right.
and to pour it out to a friend. And I would say to even pour it out to the Lord, to be able to just talk to him and, you know, get alone in your room, shut the door, and grieve and mourn and well. I know when I have experienced grief and people say, oh, you don't seem like you've been grieved. Well, no, this is how I did that. I walked and I just was, I mean, I allowed me to kind of beat my fist on God's chest until he pulled me in so tightly that I couldn't move anymore. And then I collapse. And he just holds me. He's just there. And he says, I will never leave you and I will never forsake you. And he's with me, even in the midst of pain and loss and suffering and grief. It's very real. And so, yeah.
Well, I think this one in particular, as we wrap this session up, it just speaks to the importance of recognizing, last thought, that your feelings are not wrong. It's what you do with them that matters. And I don't think we're called to stuff our feelings and just kind of push them down. I don't think you're just called to explode everywhere. I do think God calls us to sift those with his word, with people in your lives, and I think that's important.
I'd like to say one more thing before we wrap it up. And I think it's really important to realize that grief can last a lifetime. That I think sometimes we want to put a season on it and say, you should be done by now.
Right.
But the truth is there are some personal losses in life that are with us throughout our whole life. And it's not getting over it. It's learning to live with it.
Right.
And so I accept that this is my story.
Because the hurt is so real, so deep,
and
so
it comes
personal.
around all that, whether it's a person or even a perceived, like I could think of some people that grieve the ache of the loss of a parent, like maybe they've been adopted, and it's just an ache that's in them, that a person they never knew.
Right.
And they're carrying it with them to what would life have been like if.
Right.
And you can't ever get the answer to that question.
Right.
So you have to accept the life that you have and carry the grief that's a part of your story. And I think when we learn how to do that as a church, when we can say, I'm not done grieving because I can't finish this grief. I just have to learn to accept it. And the Lord is with me in my grief. He is sufficient to sustain me even in my grief. And so when we can get to theology that sinks into our core like that, then we can live with acceptance. And I can talk about it.